Hello, I'm Toyka and welcome back to our second channel geopolitics video. Today I wanted to talk about one of the biggest geopolitical events of the decade because Brexit is a big hot subject right now. In fact, you might have noticed that Brexit has become news again. The exact same story seems to come up every few months and make re-international news, but it's a bit weird because it seems like it's the same story, right? And it's particularly weird in the case of the last couple of days because what started as a really positive international story, everything was going good, the UK was going amazing, despite having no changes to the actual story, at least internationally speaking, the UK has suddenly gone in 24 hours to like, oh yeah, this is good, to oh no, everything is on fire, this is not good, this is very, very bad. How does that happen? How does the same news go from being good to being bad? What is happening with the UK? What has happened to the UK in the last few years since that vote? Let me explain in today's video, which I hope you all do enjoy, by the way. So yeah, let's start by just mentioning that unlike where you see this mentioned online, instead of actually talking about the events, they get like a Remainer, they get someone from the Brexit side, and they just yell at each other like, we want to leave all the way, or we want to remain in all the way, and it's a really interesting debate to hear from both sides, but let me actually talk about the events rather than just angrily yelling at you my opinion, because I don't have a strong bias one way or the other. I don't have a strong remain or leave bias as far as I'm aware, and maybe you can disagree with that, but let's listen to the video first, and then we'll dive into it. So let's start by talking about the EU referendum, because in 2016, the United Kingdom had a vote on whether they'd like to remain a member of the European Union, or whether they would like to leave said union, and you know what people voted? By a margin of about 2 or 3%, they voted to leave. There was 51.9% of people who decided they would like to leave the European Union, and there was 48.1% of people who would rather stay. And because of the nature of a in-out referendum with only two options, it meant that people decided they were going to leave, which meant that Brexit or whatever was the will of the people. That was what the referendum had determined. It was on a high turnout too, so there's a lot of interesting stuff that we need to kind of come back to on that, but just keep in mind that's what happened. There was a small margin in favour of people leaving the EU. So now we've gotten that out of the way, we can talk about the fact that the Prime Minister at the time, who had previously said that like when if we're going to leave, we're going to hit the button immediately, before hitting the button, which would start the negotiation process, because to leave the EU, there's a 2-year process to negotiate, and then it's cut off. You can theoretically extend it, but that's never been tested, and there's a lot of maybes in this. So basically, there's a big red button. When you hit it, the 2-year negotiating period begins. And the Prime Minister at the time just decided, I'm resigning, I'm not hitting the button, and for a while there was a little bit of a secession crisis. But what happened in the kind of aftermath is that Theresa May, interestingly enough, a Remain MP, like someone who had voted Remain and had kind of endorsed it, ended up being Prime Minister. So despite the fact that this was meant to be kind of like a leadership election that was going to end up with someone who wanted this being in charge, it ended up with kind of the opposite, where it's like, okay, this is someone who didn't want it in charge, but they're going to do it anyway. They made it very clear that they were going to Brexit, that was their plan, and that's why a few months later, in 2017, Theresa May announced that she had hit she had hit the big red button, Article 50 it's called. It's an article of the UK's membership of the EU. Any single EU member can hit that at some point, and she'd start the 2-year countdown until we'd leave the EU, which is why in March 2019, the UK will leave the EU. It's now enshrined in UK law. It's now in EU. It's a thing that will happen unless those things are changed. Again, key information to potentially come back to, which is why, now it is November of 2018. You can see why that's getting bad. But that's what she did. And then a little bit afterwards, she announced, oh yeah, I said I wasn't going to hold an election, but guess what? That was for funsies. I'm going to hold an election now. Now that Article 50 has been pressed, the button is pressed, the countdown has started, now we hold the election, and I think that was like a clever move at the time. Backfired spectacularly. She lost seat. The UK, the Conservatives at the time were very thinly in power. They had a very slight majority. They went from having a slight majority to having no majority. They were a minority government. They need to be propped up by the Northern Ireland Unionists. Let's call them the Nationalists for now, which keeps things simpler, although everyone in Northern Ireland is kind of a nationalist. But, so they had to be propped up by the Unionists in Northern Ireland, which led to a really interesting kind of agreement. But long story short, they got back into power just on a lesser majority. It was embarrassing. It was a thing. And then after they got back into power, it's like, okay, let's start negotiating this Brexit thing, eh? And you might think, oh, so in the last, 18 months since that happened, a lot must have happened, right? There must have been lots of negotiations back and forth. The only thing that's really been agreed, even to this day, the only thing that's really been agreed is that there will be a transition period. So in March of 2019, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union, but what is going to happen is until December of 2020. So as soon as 2021 rolls around, the UK will have, again, has some separate stuff that will go down, but in the time in between, the UK will have a lot of semi-membership of the EU. Let's call it that. The UK will half leave the EU, which you might think is like, oh, that's heresy. You know, the UK didn't vote for a half Brexit, but the basic goal is like, if you want a full Brexit, if you want to be able to sign your own trade deals, you need a transition period where you can do that. You need a time where all this stuff can happen. If you want, all of the benefits, you kind of need, at least there's a lot of different industries that need that extra, time. And long story short, it seems to be generally agreed that there should be some form of a transition window. Okay, is that all good? Everyone agrees. However, here's the thing. Agreeing on the transition window took a seriously long time, working out what would and wouldn't be included. Even to this day, we're not 100% sure because the details are very scarce and few and far between. But the problem is that all of the things that were wanted in a Brexit deal, or even in a transition deal, were made impossible because to keep the UK separate from the EU in terms of people and goods, well, you'd have to separate Northern Ireland from Ireland. You can't separate Northern Ireland from Ireland because that's a whole crisis. So it's like, okay, so you can separate the UK, Great Britain, let's say, from Northern Ireland. Oh, the Unionists are currently in government, so you can't do that either. And it's like, okay, so we could stay in the EU in terms of people and goods, and it's like, well, that's not real Brexit then, is it? So basically there were three impossible options that just kept getting bounced back and forth from. Again, last 18 months, all that was agreed is that there should be a transition window. The transition currently runs until December of 2020. And all else was agreed is they just kept bouncing forth like, what if we could have all three, the best of all three worlds? And yeah, so that's literally what's happened. There's been a big news story every 3 months because the EU is like, hey, we can't do that, or the UK is like, hey, we'd like that, or we'd like for this to happen, or we can't do that. And basically there's just been a big back and, headbutting of like this, and over that time, it seemed like a great idea to like, hey, if we can just get this one big thing, if we can just get them to agree to, open the border even though we don't want people going across it, or whatever the thing may be, that seemed like a really good move on paper. Like, maybe it would happen, but the truth is, it kind of whittled down the time of the clock. Like I said, there is still until March of 2019, 4 months away, to get this thing all set in stone. But that includes the time to ratify it, and it's generally considered that, like, you need months to get every European country's parliament to go through this stuff and whatever. Most countries have, like, a December recess, so it's like, okay, you really, really, really want to get this signed before the end of the year, and that's why this agreement has come out, which is basically, yeah, we'll have a transition phase, and also we'll have an agreement which will be some vague details. Again, the exact details of the agreement seem to be thin and far between. There's a 500-page document that says very little as well. And yeah, long story short, what we know right now about Brexit is that there is going to be a Brexit properly agreed later, maybe. And the reason that upsets people, you might be like, okay, what's the big deal then? So we know there's going to be a transition period. That transition period is going to kick in soon. We know, that there's going to be some form of transitional deal where the UK is basically in the EU for a lot of different forms and kind of not in other ways and won't have representation. So what's the big deal now then? Well, because this deal has finally come back, this is the finished deal. This whole time, it's always been the most likely outcome. In fact, pretty much the only possible outcome, besides not getting any deal whatsoever. And it leads to the very, very big issue of like, okay, now we have a fixed deal. This deal is all the things that you don't like about EU membership that you also don't like about leaving the EU, if that makes any sense. So it's got all the downsides for people who don't want to leave the EU, and all the downsides for people who don't want to stay in the EU, kind of mixed together. I would argue it's more complex than that, but as far as people who voted Remain or Brexit, let's just call it Remain and Brexit, sure. Remain and Leave are concerned. Both sides are very upset because it's all the things they don't like about the best option for 2 years while you work out what, again, will probably be a deal they don't like necessarily. And it's like, okay, now it's fixed in stone. Now there is a thing to argue against. Everything's on fire. So, yeah, a lot of pro-Brexit people in the current UK government resigned, and it's like, yeah, we can't support this. We're backing down. The cabinet is like, dropping members like flies. I want to say it was like 5 or 6 people, including some very senior people, the Brexit secretary, for instance. So yeah, lots and lots of, and by the way, there's been resignations over the past year as well. The government was kind of falling apart before to some extent, and this was like another big event. I don't think the government will hit a crisis, but there are talks of like having a vote of no confidence or a leadership election. There's lots of real big concerns that can happen as a result of this, because the governing party does not like this. And I mean, no one actually is on board with this. There are pragmatists who are like, okay, whatever. Like, it's the best down the middle option, but people kind of don't like it that way. But here's the thing. So I mentioned That's what's happening right now. All we know that's happening right now is there is a transitional agreement, which is kind of like being in the EU in many of the different ways. And there is a vague agreement to work some stuff out before 2021. And there's also an agreement that, like, okay, the UK can stay together, all the criteria can be met, which, again, is a whole thing. So you might be like, okay then, if that's sorted, like, it should just come down to, like, will that pass or will it not? And I think the simple answer is, like, it probably, would if you just kept forcing it. There's no way to kind of to resign the current Prime Minister. The majority of Conservative MPs who are currently in power would rather vote for what is there right now as opposed to nothing else, because the only other option that is more Brexity, because in case you're curious, there's kind of, this is where I'm leading the video to. It seems as though if you were following this before, it's like, okay, there's this deal, or there's what, like a better deal. Those were the two options. But now a deal has been set in stone. They've worked one out, and there's not very much time to fix it up. It's kind of turned into something a bit more interesting. And the Prime Minister has been very interesting with her words, because she said this a few different times. She's like, it's this deal or no deal, which is kind of the threat of like crazy all the way Brexit, or no Brexit, which is the crazy all the way, I guess crazy. The status quo is never really crazy, right? But there's like all the way on the way it remains. So she's like saying, look, we can have this middle of the road approach, or there's that, or whatever. And that sounds like, it could be some rhetoric. I'm sure there's a chance it is. But I think it's now the first time that you're starting to realize, like, oh, there is no better deal coming. It's either have no deal whatsoever. There are a lot of, if the UK leaves without a deal, there's a lot of bad things that can and potentially would, if the EU wanted them to, and if the UK did, it's likely they would. But the UK wouldn't pay any membership fees, because the UK is going to pay membership fees during the time it's partially in, partially out, and it's going to be party to a lot of laws. If you just no deal, none of that stuff, it's all the way out of the EU, but that means on all the key things like, keeping industry there's a lot of really, really good reasons you shouldn't no deal, and there's also a lot of good reasons you shouldn't no Brexit, what about that whole, democracy thing, it's just going to fuel, like a far-right rise eventually anyway, so it's like, okay, so we got two bad options, and an option people hate even more than that, and it leads you to the big problem of, like, what happens here. So, again, I think that's all the neutral, I think, is pretty fair and out there and the obvious stuff, right? Now let me talk about what I think is actually going down here. So, Theresa May is a very smart political operator. I think that's probably fair to say. I mean, like, anyone who can become Prime Minister, especially, like, a female, it's got to be a thing, right? Like, you can't become Prime Minister just by accident, like, oops, Prime Minister again. Although if that's the case, then you better believe I'm going to be Prime Minister one day. But let me show you just a few different things. So, what's worth noting about the UK's vote to leave the EU is the fact that the way people voted was kind of interesting. So if you look, for instance, at the party split, it's like a third, roughly, of Labour voters, the biggest centre-left party in the UK, wanted to leave, and 2/3 wanted to remain, whereas the Conservatives are more like 2/3 wanted to leave, and 1/3 wanted to remain. However, that still kind of leaves the interesting divide of like, okay, so there's you can't have one. The Brexit doesn't fit into a two-party system. Is my point basically there? If you look at the Lib Dems, it's still like a third to 2/3. UKIP is obviously all the way on the leaving, but even the Green Party, there's a lot of, it's called Lexit, like left-wing Brexit people out there. Brexit is a weird coalition of lots of different parties, kind of splinter wings, that all came together to make a vote happen. If you look at the same thing, by the way, this is YouGov, if you want to check the same stats. It's also, Brexit is overwhelmingly favoured by older people, and Remain is overwhelmingly favoured by younger people. And then finally, there's the education thing. I don't think it's too relevant here, but I think it's interesting that, like, universities seem to take people to being seriously Remain, whereas GCC or lower seems to. It's just the interesting thing that comes up all the time. But focus on these first two graphs. There's the party split and there's the age split. So the age split, first of all, means that if you look at opinion polling, and again, polling something that's already in process is never going to be a precise science. I guess polling is always going to just be like what people think right now. How people think and how people vote sometimes have differences. You can account for those, but again, it's something as one-off as a referendum. But keep in mind that, here's another key thing about like the weird split of the government. But let me show you the poll of polls for how, so this is what the UK looked like before we left the EU. As you can see, Remain was ahead for quite some time, and then it got super close. It was neck and neck. One was ahead, one the other was ahead. It looked like that. Right now, however, in most polls, because it's been a regular thing, it's just a big subject this year, there's a lot of money going into polling it, because it's one of the things that becomes a serious option. You can see how Remain has stayed pretty consistently ahead, and that's partly because it's hard to be committed to a Brexit you don't know about, and etc. But the fact that so consistently it's been ahead the entire year means that a lot of people have shifted their opinions. Part of that is because of the thing I just mentioned, but part of it is also because the age thing, in the last 2.5 years, and it might soon be 3 years since Brexit, the age of a country, everyone ages a little bit, and because of that, you can assume more young people, more people that were young at the time, are therefore in the Remain camp. It's a thing you can probably fairly assume, right? So those factors put together mean that there is a higher Remain population, and there is a splintered, both I guess in both sides of the thing, there's a splintered Remain, there's a splintered Leave camp. They're not, they came together for a huge referendum, and then they went separate ways, if that makes sense. And that's why I think that now there is 3 clear options on the table. There is clearly going to be an appetite. So there was already a high appetite for another referendum. I think that appetite has probably increased. I think people always like to, people who are particularly on the Remain side, like, look, this is why it's going to happen. I don't think this is like a definite thing. I don't think this is even like a, like a 95% chance. I think this is like one of the things that could be the grand plan here, because Theresa May's strategy looks so bad on paper. There's so many missteps all over the place. Could be the case, or it could be a plan to get a deal. It doesn't matter how good the deal is. No matter how good a Brexit deal is, one that exists in paper that is real and workable and doesn't harm the UK economy is never going to look good to either side. So when you do that, you have 3 options on the table, and it's like, okay, well, if there's a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, if it's real political pressure to get that through, it's like, okay, then how do you get something through when the House of Parliament, how do you get something through when the elected representatives can't do it? Well, you hold a new election, or perhaps you hold a second referendum. How do you, because if you can't just be like, oh yeah, we're just gonna not do Brexit, then that's a thing, doesn't work. You hold a second referendum, then you've got a fixed result to hold to. If it is like, once you have, because again, in any vote of a status quo versus a thing, this is why opposition parties can always have an extra kind of oomph on their arguments, because they can argue for anything. In the same way, Remain and Brexit had the big benefit for Brexit. You can argue whatever type of Brexit you want. Brexit was a coalition of people ranging from people who just wanted really like Brexit, wouldn't it be nice to be like Norway? Wouldn't it be nice to be like Switzerland? To people all on the other side, like, let's leave the Human Rights Convention, let's leave the Council of Europe, let's leave everything. Let's leave the UN, why not? Like, there's a huge range from all across the political spectrum. When you get people together like that, it's interesting that they're all together on a big idea that you all think is their version of it. Once you have a fixed version of that idea to go to, and you've seen that there are some downsides, and the UK has seen a lot of downsides. You might disagree with this, but it's like basic fact that looking at the UK, you can see like, okay, here's the GBP USD rate. It was kind of going down regardless because of the uncertainty, but like here it was on the night of the referendum at 1.45. Night after 1.29, and it went as low as 1.19 at one point. It's come down to like similar levels. You can basically see that like, okay, it was kind of bad for currency, but like, who needs currency not going abroad? I mean, more complex than that again, but it's like, interesting enough though, if you look at like the FTSE's gone up, which is the UK's biggest stock market, because the pound has become cheaper relative to other currencies. So a lot of people invest in the UK stock market, which is just a fun little side note I should mention. But looking against the euro, you can see like the euro definitely does stronger in that currency trading pair. It's like a huge difference there too. My point here is the UK has suffered. You can look at currency rates, you can look at confidence, you can look at all the relocations. There's a lot of negative news about Brexit that isn't, unlike pre-referendum, it was all scare everything on both sides was scare tactics. But now you look at it and it's like, okay, there's the very real future we've been carving out for ourselves over the past 2 years, or there's Brexit all the way because again, Brexit is a left-right spectrum in the same, as a whole spectrum in the same way Remain is a spectrum. But when you have that spectrum split down the middle, which is basically what's happened, the moderate people on the Brexit side are like, yeah, sure, this is a good thing, whereas the hardcore Brexit people are like, no, leaving, no freedom of movement, ending immigration is a key thing for a lot of Brexit voters. So if you don't have that immediately sorted, that's going to be a no-go for people. Splitting that in half by saying current deal, no deal, both options, it's an interesting thing. And yeah, if you look online, everyone across the political spectrum is just agreeing that this deal sucks. But that might be a very deliberate thing. I think everyone knows, or again, any smart operator would know this still looks like it sucks. And I think the plan is either a three-pronged referendum or a general election, or maybe it's just like okay, we'll do a second referendum with a fixed deal versus nothing. Because the biggest argument against doing a second Brexit referendum, it's the idea has come up non-stop. And I agree that if you just do a second one, it's like, well, what about a third one? What having just two referendums on the same subject immediately following each other just shows that the government can pick arbitrarily when to do it. But doing it at a later point in the process, doing it at a point where it's like, yeah, we have a fixed thing to pick for versus a fixed thing, and they're different to the original vote, and maybe there's three options on there, that's kind of clever. Especially if it is a three-pronged referendum, which I doubt would ever get across. But if it was a three-pronged referendum between current deal, no deal, and, remain, even in that situation, current deal and no deal both take half the vote, and it splits the vote, and in the same way, any third party does, the spoiler effect. And yeah, it's super fascinating in my opinion that seems to be the only way any of this makes sense. Either the UK government gets everything on board and they can find the political capital to get this through, or they need to use democracy on their side. And if you get democracy on your side, I don't see any way that doesn't end up with a Remain vote, which again, I wouldn't say I'm hugely in favour of. I would say this is a controversial thing, I think. But I think that I think Norway style deal is actually one of the would be the ideal outcome. Why not negotiate your own trade deals with the world? Because the UK is slightly different to Europe in different ways. But also, the UK has one of the largest financial markets in the world, clearing a lot of European business. Why not try and get the best? Try and squeeze the both in there somehow. Whereas some people are like, it's all European trade, or it's all, it's all trade from the rest of the world. And it's like, why not both? That's how you get rich. You don't go one source of money or a second source of money. You get both sources of money. And in case you're like, well, the EU signs pretty good trade deals. It actually has. The EU's done, I want to say, signed a deal with Korea this year, or Japan. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of countries the UK is very well connected with, particularly the Commonwealth, that have felt neglected since Brexit because they can't have a trade deal with the UK. They want a trade deal with the UK, they can't get one. You need one with the whole EU, a 500 million person bloc that takes a lot of bureaucracy that can be blocked by single-handedly by a region in Belgium, for instance. Why not get out of that? Admittedly, you lose the MEP. There is a trade-off to be made, but in terms of the economic argument, I think that's the strongest place to be if you can get financial services included. But again, no one talks about the financial services. No one talks about the this and that. They talk about with the people and Brexit, this and that. And yeah, that's why, interesting enough, I'm on the third miniature slice of the pie, I think, right now, that's getting squeezed out by the other two. If there is a three-pronged referendum, I highly doubt it would be. But I would be the one guy voting for that middle ground option. But maybe that's just me. I want to be honest at the end here about what my belief in a free thing was. Maybe you disagree with that, but again, let me know your thoughts. This is the first video where I've explained what I believe is happening, but the crazy thing is, everything you talk about Brexit always sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory. This whole thing sounds a bit like it's a grand plan, and that's because we don't know. The whole details have never been clear to us. It's always been done in a negotiating table, and that's, that's how negotiations work or whatever. But at the point we are right now, it's hard to make any real accurate decisions, and I just wanted to kind of mention that here. So thank you very much for watching this video. I'll probably private it very soon, because I just wanted to kind of do something different. A lot of people have been asking for a Brexit video, and it's like, man, no one knows for sure. Everyone, you have a pretty good idea, but it sounds like I'm like, oh yeah, so this is why jet fuel can't melt steel beams. Look, this is the jet fuel, this is the steel beams, and this is proof that it can't, this is proof that it can't melt it. Look at this graph right here. Actually, this is a good graph, look at it. It explains the split, but because, obviously, like I said, the government's a split, so is the opposition. Creates a whole nightmare mess of trying to get coalitions together to manage to get the deal through Parliament, which is the big issue here. I don't think I properly explained that one. Like I said, I'll probably promote the video soon. Thank you for watching it while I did exist, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.